first person to use the term New Testament, but it's Marcion of Sinope. And here I would hope to say that he would have the same canon list as the one we did, and yet he doesn't. In fact, he doesn't just have a different canon list, he has a radically different list. We lose 4 Gospels, Acts, the Catholic epistles, Jude, and Revelation, or the Apocalypse of John. We have the antithesis, which is a series of comments from Marcion pitting essentially the Old Testament God versus his God of the New Testament. We have the Evangelion, a singular gospel, which is somewhat akin to Luke, but with quite substantial changes. And then St. Pauline epistles, with the noticeable difference being Laodiceans interchanged for Ephesians, although they are ostensibly the same epistle. Okay, look, everyone knows Marcion was a heretic. He's one dissenting voice. We don't need to worry about his canon list. Let's just pop to the next one. And I'm sure at this point we'll get another canon list that's like ours. So here we have the canon list of the Muratorian fragment, dated between the late 2nd century and 4th century AD. For the sake of our discussion, as I always am, I will try and be generous and say it's late 2nd century. Here we have something more akin to our New Testament, although again, it's not quite mustard. Matthew and Mark have a question mark next to them, and that's because in the fragment we have, that part of the fragment is missing. So it's assumed by scholars that those Gospels were included, but we can't say for certain. Then we get to 1, 2, and 3 John. Now, I've put a question mark next to 1 John, and that's because the fragment mentions 2 epistles of John as canon. And we assume that 1 John is probably included in this, but of 2 and 3 John, we're not quite sure which way's up. Could be either, could be an amalgamation of the 2. But where the question gets really interesting is the additions rather than the omissions. It adds the Apocalypse of Peter and the Wisdom of Solomon to its canon list. So we're getting there. Okay, late 2nd century. It's not ideal for those trying to defend the New Testament of the Bible, but we're getting there at least. We're on the right track. Let's look to another friend, see if they can help us out. Origin. And again, we do okay here. Hey, we've got 4 Gospels. We've got Acts. We've got most of the Pauline, we've got all the Pauline epistles. He views James, however, and 2 Peter, and 2 or 3 John with some suspicion. But again, I'm more interested here in the additions rather than the possible omissions. He talks of the Gospel of Peter, the Didache, the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Acts of Paul, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, and 1 Clement as all divinely inspired and authoritative. So, we're not quite there again. We've still got too many additions, too many hangers-on. Now we move into the 4th, with Eusebius. And he, most interestingly of all, does not just separate between authoritative and non-authoritative. He recognizes 4 separate groupings, which he calls the recognized, the disputed, the spurious, and the heretical. In the recognized, he puts things that are quite important for those who want to justify the New Testament canon. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, all of Paul, 1 John, 1 Peter, and Revelation. In the disputed category, those that are a bit mixed, he puts Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John and Jude. And you'll notice that some of these ones are ones that Origen considered slightly mixed. James, Peter, 2 and 3 John. He then has the spurious category, and this is probably, to me, the most interesting category, because he names the Acts of Paul, Hermas, Apocalypse of Peter, Barnabas, the Didache, and the Gospel of the Hebrews as spurious. Presumably, he knows they're not written by who they say they are. But in this category, he includes Revelation. He recognises that John might not actually be Johannine, but yet it still is in the recognised group of authoritative literature. So one of those criteria for discerning what goes into which grouping, canon or not canon, which was authorship and dating, for Eusebius might not be that important. John might not have been by John, but that doesn't seem to faze him. Then, in the last category, we get some Gospels which he deems as heretical. Peter, Thomas, Matthias. And some books of Acts of Andrew, John, and others which he doesn't name as also heretical. You'll notice most interestingly here in the heretical group is the Gospel of Thomas, which Eusebius's old master, although not directly, Origen regarded as authoritative. But by the time of Eusebius, a few decades later, they've decided the Gospel of Peter's gone. That one's done. Okay, but we've still not got to our canon. There's still things that aren't included that we would expect to see in our 27 texts into the 4th century. So now our quest continues. We'll try and find another one. Codex Sinaiticus was the creme de la creme of justification for our current Bible. And as you can see in this list here, I wasn't wrong. All the Gospels, good bit of Paul, nice Catholic epistles, Jude, and John. But what I didn't know was that attached on the end, overlooked by so many, is the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hamas, ruining our pattern yet again, sneaking in at the very end to not give us our books that we need. Post 325 AD, we have not yet agreed upon a New Testament, or at least not the New Testament that we have. At a glance, a few more friends. Codex Claromontanus adds Acts of Paul, Apocalypse of Peter, Shepherd of Hamas, and omits Philippians and 1 and 2 Thessalonians. Look, Hebrews, we get overlooked quite a lot. A lot of early scholars and fathers overlook Hebrews. But to omit Philippians and 1 and 2 Thessalonians? Brave. Seal of Jerusalem adds the Gospel of Thomas. But finally, in 367 AD, Athanasius finally gives us what we might recognize as our current New Testament, and he calls it canonized. These are the books he says have been recognized. And yet, a few years later, in the Apostolic Canons, he disagrees again. And they add 1 and 2 Clement on the Apostolic Constitutions back into the mix. You'll then get to the Synod and Council of Carthage. This was a local council. And although Augustine of Hippo, who was at that council, considered it to be all and end all, with regard to the discussion of the canon, it wasn't until 1546, think about that now, 500 years ago, that the canon was affirmed as an absolute article of faith in response to the Protestant Reformation in the Catholic Church. That is a flipping long time. That is a long time to wait.